Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar titled Trauma-Informed Approaches for Pregnant and Parenting Women Who Use Alcohol During Pregnancy. For your information, all participants' microphones are muted today. If you have any questions, we ask that you please use the Q&A box that is located at the bottom center of your Zoom window task. The chat box is also available if you have any comments or technical support questions during the presentation. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available on the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute's website and will be emailed to you in the coming days. My name is Christy Inebebo. I am the FASD Prevention Program Coordinator with the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute. Saskatchewan Prevention Institute acknowledges that we live and work on Treaty Land 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and we acknowledge the various ancestral territories of the Nehiawak, Nehidawak, Nehinawak, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Anishinaapic, Nahuwei people, and the homelands of the Métis. We acknowledge that the treaties of these lands and reaffirm the responsibilities and commitments to healthy relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. At the Saskatchewan Prevention Institute, we are committed to understanding the history of colonialism and playing a positive role in the important process of truth and reconciliation. Today's presenter, Dr. Melody Morton Ninomia, is a faculty in the Department of Health Sciences at the Wilfrid Laurier University, holds a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Community-Driven Knowledge Mobilization and Pathways to Wellness, and she leads the Interdisciplinary and Indigenous Pathway to Wellness Research Group. She is bicultural, that is Japanese and Swiss German Mennonite researcher, involved in projects initiated and driven by First Nations in the area of community mental wellness, health and wellness asset mapping, and/or mental health, addictions, and healthy pregnancies. Dr. Morton Ninomia also conducts community-partnered research regarding knowledge translation as well as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention, education, and support. I'll give the floor to Dr. Melody to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Christy, and hi, everyone. I just, as a heads up, two things. One of them is I have a double screen situation, so sometimes my eyes are going to look at the slides, so I know what you're seeing. And then I am also doing this on Mentimeter, so at some point I'm going to invite you to participate. So if you have a cell phone packed in your bag somewhere, you might want to just dig that out. Thank you for that introduction, Christy. I personally am calling in. I work, live, and sort of exist mostly on the Dish with One Spoon Treaty lands in Waterloo. And if you don't know much about the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, you can learn more about it, but I included a picture of the wampum belt, which was where the treaty was recorded on a belt. And it involved many different Indigenous nations dating back to the 1700s, I think. And the Dish with One Spoon Treaty was really about sharing the resources peacefully so that there's enough to share amongst all the people then and for the in forthcoming many generations, at least 7. So I'm very grateful to be on these lands. I have this sort of infographic style way of introducing myself, and I feel like Christy highlighted some things, but I think what I want to highlight in this image here as it relates to today's webinar is to just say that some of my thinking and my research interests slash perhaps reasons why people would approach me about research is because of some of the experience I bring with me that predates my PhD work. So there was a time when I was working in the not-for-profit sector with people who were in conflict and wanting mediation or advocating and encouraging government to start more widely using restorative justice principles. And in that context, relationality features very heavily, and it's something I want to talk about in my presentation. I also want to highlight that I became a foster parent, so some of my thoughts, interests, and knowledge And so fourth is informed by being a foster parent and having a bit of a particular view into what it means to be connected into the child welfare system. And then to highlight here in the middle where it says community-based research St. John's, there was a period of time between my master's, which is where I learned more about research methods, because I did a thesis-based master's where I did research involving both a combination of surveys and interviews. And because I had developed somewhat of a skill set in that area, I was contracted as a research assistant to do work in areas of women in prison, reintegrating into society upon release from the correctional system, kids that fell through care, so emergency placement care for kids that didn't have a stable home to be living in, people who had chronic housing insecurity, and kids that grow up through care and get pregnant before they even leave care, having their children apprehended and put into child welfare. So having multiple generations of families in care. All of this research combined with becoming a foster parent featured fetal alcohol spectrum disorder for me personally. It suddenly became an area where I was thinking, I need to understand this. This is clearly an issue that touches a lot of society. And when I was looking around, I realized it was grossly underfunded, grossly resourced even in ways with like information. And so it was that informed my PhD, which was doing work around what happens after you get a diagnosis, what systems and supports come into play. So that's what I wanted to feature in that introduction. Here is an outline of what I've prepared to share with all of you. First, I'm going to start with situating alcohol in the context of pregnancy. Then I'll move to introducing 4 key principles of trauma-informed practice, just so you have a little bit of an understanding about those 4 principles before I go into describing the work that went into a scoping review, which I think was the thing that might have led to this invitation to lead this webinar. So I'll tell you a bit about the scoping review, particularly key findings as it relates to trauma-informed practice when working with people who are pregnant or parenting and using alcohol. And I'm going to end with some, like, what are the outcomes what are the documented outcomes that happen when trauma-informed practices are in play? And also, like, what are the future directions that people are really suggesting need to happen? And so oftentimes when people write up their research, they highlight their key findings and recommendations. So a lot of the recommendations I'm sharing are not my own. It's sort of a collective recommendation from many different researchers and groups that were involved in research. And yeah, I guess it goes without saying, I know Christy mentioned that there's a Q&A box. And so I don't know, Christy, I think maybe the idea was to bracket questions for the end as opposed to while I'm talking, right? Yeah.
Questions will be answered at the end.
Yeah, okay. But it'd be great if you put your questions in while I'm talking about it, so it's fresh in your memory. Excuse me. So I have these circle reminders that we're entering into a particular item on the agenda or the outline. So I'm wondering if you might want to humor me or humor yourself in this case and hold your phone up to the QR code. I don't know if you've used Mentimeter before. If you don't, if the QR code isn't working the way you want, you can also put in it's menti.com, I think. See, and then there's a 8-digit code. If you do this, then you can respond to my question on the next slide. Okay. My question that I'm asking is, what are common reasons that pregnant people consume alcohol? Your name will not show up it'll just pop up with things that you respond to in this question, to this question. Do you see the question on your phone?
I can see it on my phone.
Okay,
Yeah, you can drop a chat if you can see it.
because I don't see responses yet, but maybe people are just thinking on it. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Okay. So I'm hoping everyone can see the responses. This is why I like Mentimeter, because then everyone can appreciate what is being shared. Thank you. So the bigger the word, the more frequent someone, like the more frequently that response has been added, if that makes sense. So multiple people have said stress, trauma, depression, addiction, being unaware of pregnancy. Yeah. Social pressure, not feeling supported. That might go hand in hand with like being around people who also consume alcohol. Unaware of the risk, coping. And the coping probably goes hand in hand with coping with stress, trauma, or depression. Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for participating in that. And I think it's great that that a lot of the things being shared on this Mentimeter are things that I'm hoping to pick up on as we move forward with this presentation. Okay, I'm going to move on, and I don't know what happens if you keep adding things. So a couple of things that I wanted to flag, some of which was featured in your responses, is some of the most common reasons would be addictions. But in the context of this presentation, I know we're talking about pregnant and parenting females, but it spans all generations, all society. Maybe not all generations, it probably doesn't go to super young, but it's not unique to the demographic that we're talking about today. Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize that they're pregnant when they're drinking, because drinking is such a common social phenomenon. People might not be aware of the extent to which alcohol can affect a fetus. A lot of people think that previous generations have drank during pregnancy and there hasn't been any huge negative impact, so it's not a problem. Coping with a whole bunch of things, which I think a lot of you named, depression and so forth, but we'll just throw in there violence, poverty, being isolated, coping with mental health challenges that are not being addressed, and not necessarily knowing or having access to supports, or at least safe supports. And yeah, underestimating the impacts of alcohol. And I think there have been in the recent past, you know, either interpersonal communication or other forms of media coverage that says it's unclear, you know, how much alcohol is okay. Doctors say, you know, a drink a day is not going to be a problem or whatever. And those sort of contradict what other people in this field are finding. So I have one more question for you, and then you don't have to worry about your phone. But this time I'm wondering, what makes what's unique about alcohol? Like what makes it different from, say, other substances, do you think?
You can refresh the page on your phone so you can see the question.
Thank you, Christy. Because the scoping review I did and today's presentation is really around alcohol. And one might be like, well, why would you only talk about alcohol? Or why would you focus on alcohol? And so I'm wondering if you have a sense of perhaps why it might be uniquely situated. Thank you. So a lot of you are highlighting a very key and important part. Thank you. Okay, that's great. Yeah, so it's different in that it's socially acceptable. So that was like the #1 response that a lot of you shared. It's socially acceptable. It's also legal. It's easy to find. Compared to some substances, it's affordable. It's well advertised. So there's a lot of promotion that goes into alcohol that's funded by government as well as other corps. It's normalized, but it's also got some teratogenic properties. Teratogens, I don't know if that language is familiar, but it's like the teratogenic substances are substances that affect fetal growth, uh, and often is connected to abnormalities or different types of I don't know if I should have written something down that was much more cohesive, but it's specific to the development of fetuses. And so I don't know if you're familiar with this 2019 stat from StatsCan, and it was reflective of a 5-year period of time that 70 to 80% of Canadians or female Canadians reported at childbearing age to drink alcohol, and 20 to 25% engage in heavy drinking, which would be 4 or more drinks on one occasion. But the reasons people drink are highly varied, as you already know. In some cases, it's a social lubricant, like people do it because that's what's normal and common amongst their family and friend circle, and other people might be drinking for other reasons. Some important predictors of alcohol consumption during pregnancy could include the amount of alcohol consumed before pregnancy and also being in an abusive relationship. And girls and women in particular are disproportionately affected by intimate partner violence. Also having lower rates of employment with livable wages, often carry an inequitable burden of parenting and caregiving responsibilities. And alcohol is an easy substance to find that is often used for self-medication. I don't really know, I'm sorry, because this isn't a two-way call, I don't really know where all of the people that are joining this webinar are coming from. So perhaps some of this is very much old news, and for others, it might be some sort of starting to think in directions that people hadn't thought about before. But the truth is, people generally are not that comfortable talking about alcohol during pregnancy because there's all kinds of fear, stigma, and judgment connected to it. But if we really want to support people who are consuming alcohol during pregnancy, we do have to talk about it. But what does it take? Because I don't think it's as simple as some people might suggest. It is and it isn't, but I hope by the end we can get to a place where we can talk about that a bit more. So I want to touch base around the trauma-informed principles that underlie what I'm talking about, but it really played a big role in how the scoping review was conducted. So by trauma-informed practices, it's often abbreviated to TIP. So TIP is not really about disclosing or asking people to disclose their trauma or their traumatic events or treat the trauma directly. It's trauma-informed principles and practices are about supporting the healing and acknowledging that there are circumstances where it can be traumatic and we really don't want to re-traumatize anyone. And so there are 4 key principles that guided the work that we did. And this is, I feel like trauma-informed principles and practices have been named and used in different ways. So you'll find other types of language, but sort of underlying principles are still the same around these 4 items here. So one is around trauma awareness, safety and trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and connection, strengths-based, and skill building. And what's key across all 4 of those principles is being relational or having strong relationships. So I'm just introducing the terms now. And in the next few slides, I'm going to ask you a few questions that are really targeting people who might work in spaces where you are supporting people that might be pregnant or parenting and having used alcohol. So if you're not working in that sector, maybe the questions won't resonate with you as much. But then what I'll do is I'll go into more examples of what this looks like and what people in the research are reporting. And maybe one more thing before I jump into the next slides is these are the terms associated with 4 principles, but when people write about projects or programs, they might not use trauma-informed principles. They might not use those exact words. So some of the types of language that might be indicative of trauma-informed principles at work could be words like judgment-free, emotionally safe, culturally safe, so using self-determination as core to an approach, individualized care, or like women-centered care, holistic, harm reduction, and like wraparound services often are connected to some of these principles. So I don't know if you can tell, but the pink bubble has a bolded term, so I'm going to work through each one. So whichever term is bolded is the one that these questions are connected to. So depending on where you work, do the people in your organization have a pretty basic understanding of causes of trauma, like where trauma could often happen with the people that you work with and what some of the possible effects are? You know, what kind of information about trauma is made available to the people seeking supports? Are there staff or programs that provide trauma-specific services if they want support for healing from trauma? Depending on where you work, if there are a lot of Indigenous people in the city or neighboring communities, are there community elders or knowledge guardians that can speak about healing with First Nations, Inuit, or Métis folks that access programs, supports, or services? Thinking about safety and trustworthiness, consider who the first point of contact is when someone reaches out for support or to inquire about a program or a service. Has a lot of thought been put into like how the phone message sounds if someone calls after hours and there's no one to answer the phone? Who is answering those calls? Who's leaving the voice message? And to what extent would you say that it embraces a lot of the trauma-informed principles that we'll talk about? And thinking outside of the sort of the virtual space, so phone or email, even when people come to the space physically, what kind of welcoming or safe environment is in place? Consider walking through all of the different spaces that people go in, and has a lot of thought been gone into the safety for both the service users and the staff. So for example, this might be a trite example, but some people might not ever want to have their back facing a door. Are the chairs situated in a way that people don't have to worry about who's going to walk in behind them? And what steps have been taken to support cultural safety? Thinking about choice, collaboration, connection, how are the people that are being supported by your program or service encouraged to have open communication? You know, how are people given options, choices, when and how? Yeah. And then how do you support people feeling included and having their voices be heard in ways that matter? Do staff use, I use people skill. I don't know what some people call it, soft skills. It's like the skills that might not be in a you can't just teach people skills, unless some people are just inherently good communicators and are intuitively good at reading people's emotions and where they're at. So how do staff use those kinds of skills to build relationships? And how are mistakes and uncertainties handled? Like, what if people make a misstep, how are those situations handled? Are they used as opportunities for learning and doing better? A lot of these things sound easy, but like if you're the one that made the mistake, it's often like not that easy. So like how do you respond to that as colleagues or as the person who made an error? Yeah. And around strengths-based and skill building, can programs and services shift away from thinking about deficits, like what are the problems that we need to work on, but also shift some of the gaze onto the strengths of people and working from that as somewhat of a starting point? Are there opportunities for people to support each other, so peer support? Are there opportunities for people accessing services to inform the supports based on their experiences? And to what extent are staff trained and mentored around trauma? Relationships are fundamental to all of those principles, because I don't think you can do any of those things without attending to relationships. And that'll become reiterated as we move forward. But I want to touch really briefly on how this work is inherently tied to fetal alcohol spectrum disorder prevention. So reducing the amount of alcohol or trying to sort of curb alcohol consumption at all during pregnancy is a form of FASD prevention. And this September month is often associated with like FASD awareness. Maybe a lot of you are part of some of that awareness or those activities. But trauma-informed practices are a core component of FASD prevention. And I don't know if you're familiar with the 4 levels of prevention, but I feel like if I'm going to be talking on this topic, I have to mention it because I think it's something that every person can understand and get involved with, either in your personal life or work life. So when we're talking about FASD prevention, there's several levels, or the concept has been broken down into levels. Level 1 is like just broad level awareness around, healthy pregnancies and hazards of drinking alcohol and so forth. It can be done from a strengths-based lens, but also a lens that's sort of highlighting potential risks. Level 2 is when you're doing some of the level type 1 work, but targeting people who are sexually active and could be using alcohol. Level 3 is when you know someone is pregnant and is using alcohol. Level 4 is even after someone's had a child and might still have more children, the intervention or the work that you do at this level 4 is in efforts to prevent future children from having FASD and so having like healthy pregnancies moving forward. But in order for all of these levels to actually be effective, there needs to be supportive policy to ensure that happens on a larger scale. And the literature that we were looking at was only looking at levels 3 and 4. So we were looking at people who were pregnant or parenting. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly about a scoping review. I don't know if any of you've ever done one. Maybe you've never even read a scoping review paper, but I just want to give you a sense of like the work that went into it, so it frames what I'm going to share with you, because it does have limitations. So for our scoping review, we looked at papers that were published between 2005 and 2022. So that is not quite a 20-year window, but it's looking at literature that in which like FASD became a topic of conversation, and I think there was more awareness around some of the concepts that we're talking about in the research field. And we purposefully included papers that came from these regions, and we picked these countries because we knew that there was quite a lot of research coming out of these parts of the world around alcohol during pregnancy, but I'll share with you how many papers actually met our inclusion criteria in the end. We specifically only looked at including papers that were reporting on interventions with pregnant or parenting girls or women. I just want to put a caveat here that we were open to any gender identity, but in reality, the literature was using the language of girls and women. So it's really focused on sex-based findings. So reported on pregnant or parenting women who used alcohol, potentially just alcohol, but in many cases, research was on alcohol and other substances. And if they were reporting on people who had children with FASD, we included those as well. They had to report on approaches, programs, tools, or supports or models. And there had to be some kind of evidence talking about their trauma-informed practices. We were not limiting papers that didn't use that language, so we used a lot of terms that would describe trauma-informed practice. So it was a lot of work to read through and pick out papers to see if they were actually reporting on that. And just to give you a sense of how many papers were gathered, the figure on the right is just it's just a way of demonstrating how we selected the papers that were included. So we conducted a very rigorous search. We worked with 2 librarians to refine a really good, it's called a search strategy. And we ran it in 5 different databases because this topic is not only found in, say, health literature, it's also found in things that are more around the social work field and psychology and so forth. So we wanted to have a well-rounded search strategy. And in the end, when we gather all those papers together and remove any duplicate papers, we had about 7,615 papers. And then 2 people screen, and if any paper was screened in by one and screened out by another, they had to meet to discuss and come to consensus. So that's how we worked through screening. And after making sure that all of the papers that met the inclusion criteria were moving forward for analysis, at that point, there were only 36 studies. So the findings are based on those 36 studies. And for each of the 36 studies, we recorded all of this information. And I don't need to spend much time on it, but just to give you a sense of what we pulled out of each of the 36 study papers. We just sort of grabbed information about the study itself, the type of approach or intervention they were talking about, the outcomes from the intervention or approach, and what were the recommendations from the people who wrote the paper for both practice as well as research. In the end, of the included studies, 22 took place in the US, 13 in Canada, and 1 in the UK. This is not to say that's how many programs there are. It just means that's how many research papers were available for us to review. 17 of the studies were reporting on live-in or outpatient treatment centers. 6 of them were in non-medical settings. So they could have been a place where they were offering case coordination. So an entity is helping coordinate different supports and services for individuals or families. Or it could be that they were integrating supports from different places and working with clients. or a wraparound program where someone comes into a place where all the supports and services are wrapped around the individual, so they don't have to go find and seek out every type of support that they need. 4 were from medical clinics that were a single point of access, so they would come in and then they would be connected to different supports. 4 were about home-based or outreach programs. 14 included mothers only. 14 included pregnant women and mothers. And 9 were focusing on just pregnant people only. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is I'm going to sort of walk through each of those 4 principal areas. So remember those 4 bubbles that I talked about earlier? I've organized my slides around each of those. So around trauma awareness, what did people report from their study, and then giving some not super granular examples, but examples that speak to what trauma awareness looks like in the studies that were included. So for trauma awareness, that's again referring to learning about what trauma is about, how trauma can impact people or groups, and how people cope with trauma. It recognizes the importance of thinking about trauma when you're supporting people. So instead of just seeing the way someone is communicating or presenting and not even considering how trauma might be at play and how you interact with them, trauma awareness is having that in your thinking as a service provider or support person in ways that don't require people to have to talk about their trauma. So examples of how this looked in several studies was having staff being trained in understanding historical and contemporary forms of trauma. So intergenerational trauma is talked about a lot in the context of Indigenous people's health and well-being. It's not this concept is not limited to only Indigenous contexts, but it is something that that came up in the literature in reference to Indigenous peoples. Recognizing that pregnant people often have coexisting complexities that are related to gender-specific social determinants of health, which I have a slide about because that's a mouthful. So when I use the language of gender-specific social determinants of health, this is about recognizing that trauma for pregnant people using alcohol is usually happening in the context of like one might call like a constellation of factors. So if you look at all of the words above and below, like disability, poverty, experiences of loss, and so forth, look at all those terms and those concepts. All of those things are very much colored by people's gender. Like the gender plays a big role in how all of those kinds of things are experienced by an individual. So I'm moving from trauma awareness, and now I'm talking about safety and trustworthiness as a second principle. This is referring to the space that people are in, the physical environment, their emotional and cultural safety that's needed for people to develop some sense of trust with others and engage in some form of healing. Ways in which safety and trustworthiness can happen on the ground. In the studies that we looked at, we're talking about staff who were consistently showing non-judgmental, welcoming, and respectful ways of interacting with pregnant and parenting people. Staff at all levels fostered a sense of cultural safety and trust between, this is important, staff and clients and managers and other community agencies. So not just at the people accessing services, but also with their colleagues, their supervisors, and people at other organizations. Because I think the culture of a program or an organization has a huge impact on the people who are accessing this supports and services. This might sound really trite, but I think leadership can really change the culture of an organization. So if the organization isn't prioritizing sort of trauma-informed practices even within their own staff and team, it's clients and people accessing support see that. So it needs to be pervasive across all levels. So that includes modeling how to create safe spaces, how to be empathetic, show compassion, show care, and being reliable and consistent is one way of showing care and compassion, and increasing senses of safety and trust. And these are like foundational things that need to be in place for people to be able to build, teach, and support healthy and sustainable relationships. Not only with the people that are engaged with the supports and services, but also in their lives outside of those contexts. I think I have more examples. Yeah. Around safety and trustworthiness, some studies highlighted that they attributed some of their safety and trustworthiness, say, were connected to the fact that they had women-only supports. So it's really focused on gender-specific or like sex-specific types of contexts. Indigenous women who access supports and services highlighted the importance of having Indigenous staff and having cultural safety practices in place. Helping women form healthy relationships. I don't think I can underscore housing enough, although it wasn't as prominently featured in the study, but I know it prominently features in many other spaces. I'm guessing a lot of you have heard of the housing first sort of model of like, if you don't have a safe place to hang, put your head at night, it's really hard to be able to do other things when you're worried about just having your very basic needs met. And needing people to help with navigating different systems and being able to connect to their children. And in particular, wraparound and single access where people can go to one place and be connected to a number of different supports have been highly effective. And this one's interesting. It wasn't talked about in a lot of papers, but there was a lot of success when staff were trusted, and trusted staff, if you will, were able to support women in engaging with child welfare systems. Women felt safer when they didn't have to navigate that alone. So this is the third principle, choice, collaboration, and connection, which is really about making sure people have choice and the ability to self-determine, and connecting people with other people, but it has to be done through trust and accountability, so across different levels of care. And so I wanted to highlight in the note in the blue box below is that when the relationships between staff and the pregnant or parenting women were strong, there was an increased sense of belonging, community, safety, support, and hope. And if the relationships were strong between the women within the program, it also created a foundation for sustainable social support networks. So even if the program or service was time sensitive or time constrained, sometimes women would benefit from having long-term relationships that they could take with them as they move away from the formal supports. And initiatives that connected women with educational or job opportunities really helped create ways in which people could sustain their choices around reducing or abstaining from substance use and working towards good mental well-being. And then this is connected to the earlier point. When people were collaborating across agencies, people were more likely to reach their goals. And when programming considered including infants and children so that they could work with the family dyad, so like the mother-child relationships, then the women had increased confidence, improved mental well-being, and were able to decrease their amount of substance. Another example around sort of facilitators of connection was having spaces that didn't feel clinical. So some women were a fan of having home visits, but other women don't want other people in their home because it feels too invasive. But I have been to clinics where they have purposefully made spaces in the clinic feel homey, so it doesn't feel cold and clinical. So things like that make a big difference. And offering supports to people to navigate the child welfare system. You knew me personally, you'd know I'm I don't like to take up so much space, but anyways, I'm sorry, I'm just going to keep talking. I have a few more things I want to go through. So the fourth principle is around strengths-based and skill building. This is really about drawing on people's capacities, abilities, and resources by recognizing and appreciating and building on them. Developing and promoting strategies, skills, and knowledge that really improve one's ability to cope, manage, and ultimately thrive. So this includes being flexible around people's lives. Some people might miss appointments because they don't have childcare, or they can't organize transportation, or the transportation has fallen through, or they don't have safe housing. And one piece that wasn't discussed in the literature, but I know is something that needs to be considered, is disabilities. So some people might have disabilities that are invisible, undisclosed, or misunderstood. And so meeting appointments or getting to appointments could be a challenge, and to be flexible and not fill in your gaps and assume that they're not taking it seriously. Motivational interviewing was a very common skill that was used by staff working at naming strengths, plans, resources, and motivations around their own personalized goals. Skill building also include parenting skills, self-care and life skills, and for people who are pregnant, including things like, childbirth sessions. And then for some, it was having access to training, even just around how to access education and how to apply for work. And in some cases, people talked about how they enhance communication skills, of how do you communicate effectively as you're trying to access certain types of systems of care. Okay. So I have a couple of slides where these are like super specific things that people can do, because I feel like my previous slides were a bit more descriptive, but these are like tangible things that people can do as ways to facilitate discussion. And I put the 4 principles in the top right-hand corner of my next 4 or 5 slides, so that as you go through each example, you can see how they're connected to those principles. So the first one is to discuss alcohol use with people before pregnancy is just a routine practice. Ask people, what they know about the effects of drinking during pregnancy before, talking at them about alcohol. Like, see what people actually know, because people may know a lot, and then chat about the information that they know. If someone is sexually active and consuming alcohol, help make sure that they have access to contraception if their intention is not to get pregnant, or if they want to, if alcohol is part of their regular life, to be very mindful of timing, because some people may not recognize that alcohol can impact fetus at a very early stage in the fetal growth. If a person asks about alcohol, even before either party knows about pregnancy, you can talk frankly about the possible effects. And reassure them that it's never too late to reduce or stop drinking. And if someone is like planning about pregnancy, just weave in some conversation about the role of alcohol in their current life. And then for people who are feeling awkward or thinking, how am I going to navigate this when my family or my friends or my partner are constantly drinking, and I don't really want to say that I'm pregnant or offend people or whatever the case may be. So one thing can be, talking to people about how to say no or say something that doesn't tell people that they're pregnant, but is more of a socially acceptable way to respond. So doing some coaching around that. You can discuss the idea of having mocktails if people are trying to curb their alcohol consumption. Most people probably don't drink all by themselves, but if someone is thinking about talking through things that are going in their life that might make it hard to cut back. And also inquiring if the partner is someone who might consider stopping or curbing their drinking in partnership with the person who's pregnant. Don't assume that the partner is supportive, because it is possible that, that's not really an option. And making sure that people know that there are local resources available if they're in a violent or abusive relationship. But sometimes these kinds of resources have to be shared discreetly, obviously. And if someone trusts you enough to share that they're in an abusive relationship, I think that says a lot about your character in a good way. And your response matters a lot. And I think being non-judgmental and being empathetic and seeing how you can help support them being safe is usually a helpful response. And respect that the person that's talking to you knows their situation best. And if you have concerns about their safety, find out ways that they're on board with. So it can be very, I think you would be eroding trust if someone confides in you and then you talk to child protection. But if the concern is for children, some options are to call child protection with them, with their full knowledge. And that was one of the studies was talking about having staff or people that were supportive that would call child welfare with the consent and the person present on the call at the same time. So some outcomes. These are a bit more overarching outcomes, but when trauma-informed practices were incorporated, there was increased hope, confidence, skills, strategies, and motivation. The level of stigma, guilt, and shame went down. And when people reported on relational components of their approaches or their services, they reported that people felt welcomed and cared for, and their overall circumstances and their well-being improved, and in many cases had a social network that grew and that they could maintain outside of the particular program or service. So relationships are essential. So relational approaches are a prereq for trust. And then trust is a prereq for honest conversations. And honest conversations are essential for being supportive. So like these are all interrelated, but I think at its core, being relational is super important. It's sometimes time intensive. It takes a long time to build relationships where people have trust. And this is one of the challenges with some programs that are very short term. There isn't time built in to build relationships. And we broke down the recommendations that authors shared by frontline. So like the people directly engaging with people, accessing supports and services, the agencies of the organization that frontline workers work in, and then sort of the systems that are connecting the different agencies together. So at the frontline level, these are some indicators that trauma-informed practices are in place. So job descriptions might indicate that it's a requirement. There might be trauma-informed practices training and education that's like ongoing and offered at advanced levels to staff. Expecting staff to gain training and education and having places to talk about it and discuss amongst themselves and talk about how it's going in the agency. I'm gonna guess most people don't have time or make time for that. So I know that's a tricky one, but arguably is important. Training includes examining how TIP is already embedded in the existing practices, as well as thinking about how things can be done better. And then inviting people who are accessing the services with the lived experiences of trauma to be saying how well it's working. At the organizational level, having policies and guidelines that support trauma-informed practice is key. Having reviews, so like an internal review, like how are we doing? Are there resources for people who want to learn more or have a refresher? Are there champions within the organization that can like make sure that this is on the radar of people and offering or getting advanced training? And where relevant, is there universal screening? So like consistent ways of engaging in conversations of alcohol use. So I have in the green box, like in one of the, in the book Trauma Matters, there's an example of where they did their own study and found that 80% of the women accessing live-in treatment had trauma-related experiences. And when they trained all their staff and got money for doing that and did an evaluation to see how they were doing by embedding trauma-informed practices, they were able to identify areas of concern. And so they had quite a lot of, it was helpful. They were able to garner funding to support the training and evaluation, and were able to make some major changes. In terms of linking with other programs and services that staff, like a form of an indicator of trauma-informed practices, how well do they know about other programs and services that are available? Are people collaborating or cultivating collaborations? And partnering with different programs and services. So there was an example where a bunch of different organizations, 150 organizations, came together and decided they wanted to sort of pool knowledge and training and resources and work together to deliver a training across staff from multiple agencies to really sort of form stronger collaborations and talk about trauma-informed practice. And all of these things serve people who are accessing supports and services, obviously. And some other indicators at a systems level is making sure that people have access to the funding, recognize that trauma-informed practices is actually cost-effective, so the return on investment is major. And they need to support at the system level collaboration between agencies, find ways to support people to have staff, good staff morale, and policies to support trauma-informed practice. And this one's hard, but if there are opportunities to evaluate efforts, that is always a helpful way of reflecting on what's going well. Okay, I have a few resources. It's not exhaustive. I can share this with Christy for circulation, or I can copy and paste them into the chat. But I think that concludes what I prepared for today. So I'm happy to stop sharing my screen and open it up for comments or questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Melody, for sharing the scoping review. Okay, I can. There are no questions so far from anybody. Oh, just a couple of people saying thank you.
Oh, yes, my pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Melody, for this presentation and sharing your knowledge today. And thank you all for joining this webinar. When you close the window, you will be directed to a link where you can complete a short survey evaluation of this session. Completing these evaluations help us to create programming and resources that support you in your work, and we appreciate your time it takes to complete them. Thank you once again.
Very welcome.
Somebody says that is the
Oh,
link. Okay,
sorry,
yeah,
that was
that's
me.
you. Okay.
If people are like, if they want to read more, so the paper itself breaks down every paper that was included and describes each one. So if that's something that interests people, that's in the paper, which I didn't include in this presentation. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'll share the recording and the link to everybody here. Okay, thank you
Great.
and
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye, Christy.